Hello, and welcome to Exploring Journalism's Future, a podcast powered by the Institute of Media and Public Trust at Fresno State. I'm Professor Betsy Hayes, and I am on the faculty of the Department of Media, Communications, and Journalism here at the university. From analyzing existing models to discovering innovative ones, from crafting content strategies to optimizing distribution, and everything in between. This podcast is going to connect you with a diverse array of experts and advocates dedicated to revitalizing and fortifying one of the world's most vital industries. And on this episode, we are so thrilled to have one of our alums from the MCJ department, Eric Johnston, who, among other things, which we will discuss, is the CEO and publisher of Sonoma Media Investments. So Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much, Betsy. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Yay, we're so grateful to spend time with you today. So let's start at the beginning, right? So talk to us about you and your path as a journalist. And then, of course, we want the pivot into the digital world very early, which is also going to be fun. But, how did it start? What motivated you to get rolling here?
So, believe it or not, it was in 8th grade in junior high school. And my homeroom teacher, Mrs. Poole, was assigned the task of producing the school newspaper, but it was really a newsletter. It was an 11 by 17 folded in half and built with an IBM Selectric typewriter that had italics and Roman typeface. And it was mostly song dedications and lunch menus. And in February it was pink, and in March it was green, and it kind of followed the seasons. And at the end of that year, I was named editor-in-chief, because you don't want to give that kind of power to, someone at the beginning of the year, right? So, and I had a great time working with my fellow students. And so when I went into high school, I thought this would be a very natural thing for me to do. And so I signed up to be on the school newspaper. Well, to be on the school newspaper, you had to take a full year of academic journalism, which was a classroom study of writing, photography, editing, layout, the whole thing, how to produce a product, essentially, ad sales. And at the time, every freshman was required to meet with their guidance counselor and a parent or guardian. And so I sat down in my guidance counselor's office. And at the time, I had this romantic vision of being a research scientist, Bunsen burners and lab coats and things. And I was sitting across from Mrs. Durham, who had actually been my counselor in 8th grade. She got promoted as well, strangely enough. And my mom, and she said, "So Eric, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to be a scientist, a biologist." And she looked at me and she kind of glared at me through those Sally, Jesse, Raphael red horn rim glasses and said, "But you stink at math." And I said, "Well, I don't think I stink." And she goes, "Well, do you like it?" And I said, "I don't like it that much." She goes, "What do you like?" And I said, "I really like my academic journalism class. I like working on the newspaper." And she says, "Maybe you should explore that." And that was the starting pistol. So from there, I spent the next 3 years on the newspaper and the yearbook staffs. My first paying job was as a sports photographer at the local newspaper in Lodi. They hired me on to take Friday night football games. So where my counterparts were out working, flipping burgers or whatever, I was on the sidelines of football games in the darkroom. And I just loved it. And so I went from there. I went to junior college. I went to Fresno State. Worked on at the time the Insight, for the Department of Journalism, and really enjoyed just that aspect of it. I went back to Lodi after school. Had a hard time finding. This was back in '93 when it was pretty tough finding new jobs as a new journalist in the industry. Interviewed a bunch of places, and I ended up going back to Lodi and getting on at the Lodi Sentinel again as a photographer. And, we talk about pivots. This was one where 95, we were just getting started with digital photography. The cameras were big and the cameras were expensive. And there was a thing called the Digital Photojournalism Workshop. And you could go to a conference, and this one was in Concord. You're assigned a story. You go out, you shoot it with a digital camera, you come back, somebody lays it out on a paginated page. This is before desktop publishing was really a deal. And then it's output to a direct-to-plate machine, and it's printed, and you have a newspaper over the course of a week. And I finished my story early, and they said, "Would you like to build a web page for our thing?" And I said, "What's a web page?" And so they showed me how to essentially read the design code that went into websites. And so that started the next 20 some years of my career were spent building websites, and then the businesses around websites and the audiences around websites and all of those things in digital publishing. So all of those things kind of got me through a long period of time, which has always been connected to journalism and the newspaper industry. And then, from there, it was just kind of more administrative work. And now I'm really glad to be back in a local community with a couple of local newspapers and serving the community in the capacity as a publisher.
Oh my goodness. I love that story. And I would imagine that folks who are listening to this podcast, folks who love journalism also tend to really like history a little bit. And behind me, that door, is the old Insight office. And so we're actually about 2 feet away from what Eric was discussing at his time at Fresno State. The Insight was a weekly newspaper that was handled by the students and the department for about a 25-year period. And we won't get into all of our campus journalism lore, but I found that particularly entertaining as I'm looking at the door for where you got your journalism start back there with the Insight.
So, it was surprising. There was a lot of competition between the Collegian and the Insight at the time. We had a 2 newspaper community on campus, and it was actually pretty entertaining.
Yeah, no, tons of fun. And the Collegian, you will be happy to know, celebrated its 100th birthday not too long ago. So the fact that any, a college newspaper celebrating their 100th birthday is definitely worth celebrating. And yeah, so it's still going strong. It's still going strong. Whereas the Insight was retired when, we decided we were just going to be a 1 newspaper campus. So back to the pivot. So obviously part of it was a little bit of happenstance, right? You happen to be fairly efficient. You finished your assignment in record time. And so they thought, okay, here's this person, maybe he can do this thing that we need to be done. But obviously, you enjoyed it or you wouldn't have stuck there, right? Was that kind of the primary driver, or did you sort of have a little bit of a crystal ball vibe there that maybe this is where things are going? Kind of maybe talk about what stuck there, because that was a moment.
It was a moment, and I think looking back, if I wish I could say, I had this great, kind of feeling that it was going to be the next wave, but I think truly it was just something that was different than what I had been doing. And it was interesting and it was exciting to try to do something new. I had some basic experience and kind of access to the internet when I was at Fresno State. A friend of mine and I used to kind of do stuff, but it wasn't the internet that today, or that we all know today, right? This was just a new method of communication, which I thought was really fascinating. And I recall going back to the publisher in Lodi and saying, look, we need to do this. If we buy this domain name and we can do these things and we can charge 25 cents an ad for classified, we can pay the whole way and we can put our content online. And I would say there was a reluctance to do it at that point. They didn't quite get it, right? Yeah. Again, this was in 1995. And so it was just kind of this new wave. So I ended up leaving California. I went back east outside of Philadelphia for a while, where I was working in IT and systems management, again, in a newsroom. And I have no IT background. I have no programming background. I was just kind of learning my way as I went, but I was setting up templates in the newsroom and, helping people with their laptops when their keyboards broke. And I was building web pages on the side for the local art museum, for example, or the local, it was a local art museum primarily. And I remember one day the editor was saying, how are these people getting these websites built? Who built these websites? And they found out that I was doing them in the community. And they said, well, why aren't you building ours? And so then I started building websites for the company. And that kind of took me back, and it brought me back to California, working with at the Fresno Bee for a while, building sites out there. And you know what? It just was one of those things where I enjoyed doing it, and I was reasonably good at it, and there weren't a whole lot of people doing it. So it was just a unique opportunity at the time.
And I love the fact that you mentioned that you didn't have an IT background. And I think that's a very common story for folks who sort of embraced that technology at that time. Building the plane while you're flying it is
that's very true.
Yeah. It feels like that's what we were doing, right? And hey, you're smart. You kind of get this thing. Why don't you go with it? And I love the fact that so many opportunities sort of have that same story.
Well, I was really fortunate when I graduated from Fresno. I had aspirations of working for, large companies, the Sacramento Bee or the Fresno Bee or what have you. And it just didn't work out. Mm-hmm. And I think, by going back to Lodi and being the photographer in a relatively small 6-day-a-week newspaper, it gave me a chance to do everything under the sun. So where I might have been a staff photographer at the Sacramento Bee, I could still be a staff photographer 25 years later, which is a fantastic profession, but it wouldn't have changed. But when I was in Lodi, we helped establish color, color imaging in the paper every single day by, with a Macintosh and a film scanner. And, there were a couple of occasions I was able to run the press and build color keys and kind of understand all of the aspects of the operation, plate making machines and stuff that journalists generally don't learn in the classroom. And so they were kind of it was the germ of this, I guess, illness that, I've caught ever since, where, technology's had such an important part to play in our industry that I was able to kind of get in early on and kind of understand the fundamentals of how it applied to what we have to do as an industry, but more importantly, how we can do better, leveraging technology. Good timing, I guess.
Right? Lightning in a bottle. It's great.
Yeah, right.
So which is a perfect segue to what you're doing now with, one of your primary news organization, news outlet is the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, which has been, successful, right? Fiscally and with subscription numbers, and in a time where, unfortunately, I think we would all agree, that's not, your typical story. And so I would love to hear, obviously you have a great vantage point being the CEO and publisher. Why is it working for y'all, first of all? And how potentially could other communities learn from you, use a little bit of your model? How can we help others through your success?
Oh, that's a great question. Having worked for a number of large, both large publicly traded and then larger family companies, you kind of see different dynamics in how the business is run. Now we know there's a lot of venture capital and a lot of vulture capital that is buying up these organizations, these small community publishers, because there is still profit left if they pull out kind of these critical resources, journalists and salespeople, and they keep taking pieces out to pull profit with it. We're really fortunate here, and I can think of maybe, half a dozen that are in a similar position, or maybe a dozen that are similar to us, where we're very fortunate in that we have local ownership and we have, to a degree, local accountability with our ownership. So the Press Democrat was owned for the better part of the 20th century by a local family, the Finley family, and it's since the late 19th century. And they sold to the New York Times. And then the New York Times ran this group as part of their regional publishing group. They had a couple of them in California. They had some different places. And then they sold it about 12 years ago to a company out of Florida that really didn't know quite what to do with the company. And so when they were looking to sell it again, a group of local investors got together and said, "Look, we want to preserve and protect local community journalism." I mean, some of our advisors, our investors are, like Jeannie Schultz, for example, who's the widow of Charles Schultz, the author of Peanuts, or the kind of lead engineer and I think employee number 3 at Intel, who made the Intel Pentium chip, and the guy who was CEO at Dolby Surround Sound. I mean, all the different people who happen to live in Sonoma County who believe in what's going on, and all led by our managing partner, who's lived here for a long, long time, and said, "Look, this is a really important resource." So we're fortunate in that their primary mission, while we want to be sustainable and we want to be profitable and we want to be able to invest in ourselves, the primary mission really is to serve the community through quality journalism and a quality product. And so that's really paramount to this whole equation. We are heavily involved in the community. We sponsor lots of events. The fact that we have, me, a publisher in town, says a lot. A lot of community markets don't have local publishers anymore. We still have great relationships with our local advertisers. We have, 4 or 5 regional banks in Sonoma County. Many, if not all of them, advertise in one way or another. We have some locally owned grocery store franchises. We have local, hardware franchises. Those in themselves are unique. So I grew up in the Valley. I grew up in Stockton and worked for a long time in Modesto. And there aren't a whole lot of communities our size who still have, 5 locally owned and managed regional banks. Most have been absorbed by the B of A's or the US banks or what have you. Most don't have, locally owned grocery stores. Most don't have So we work really hard to maintain and manage those relationships with our partners, with our advertisers, because they still sustain the company. The same thing is true on the subscriber side. We work really hard to make sure that our subscribers know that what they're paying for is quality, objective, truthful journalism that has some relative context, relativity to them. It's relative to their lives, right? If we were charging $800 a year and all we were doing was aggregating content from other parts of the world, then they weren't going to care. They wouldn't care as much about it. But we have about 170 employees in our company. 80 of them are newsroom employees in one capacity or another, whether they're reporters or photojournalists or designers or whatever that math looks like, right? And I think that we're probably the largest news organization between San Francisco and Seattle on the West Coast. And that's not an accident, right? That's intentional. And we work really hard to maintain that. We have to do the same things everybody else does. We have to look for ways to save. We have to look for ways to save costs and to become more efficient and to leverage technology for the betterment of the company. But we're always doing it with an eye towards how can we continue to preserve and protect our journalism and our sales infrastructure so that we can serve the community that we need to be served. We talk about others like us. I know there's some family-owned companies in Santa Fe and in Galveston and Charleston, South Carolina that are doing fantastic work, and New Orleans and Baton Rouge, largely because they are locally owned and locally focused, which is important. So that's a little bit of the secret sauce, and we talk about how do you spread it. I'm not sure that there's a way to scale it. I mean, it'd be great. Some communities, you hate to say it, are maybe so far gone that it may be hard to get that back without major reinvestment in people or process. I look at where I lived in Stockton. My parents complain. They want to know, why can't we buy the Stockton Record? Well, there's really not much to buy, but there's a name and there's a brand and there's a history there. So there's still value, and I think that the community would still really value it if their ownership group kind of made that commitment to do it. But it's a challenge, no question.
Yeah. So the mission that you so beautifully articulated, I would imagine that that's a little rinse and repeat as far as your talking points. I'm feeling like that's something that you and the employees at your organization talk about all the time. Is that a correct assumption?
It is. All of our employees are very aware of the fact that this is kind of a unique situation that we're in. And when we hire people in, we tell them that of the unique nature of this company relative to the industry as a whole. And when our salespeople are out talking to our customers, we talk about the importance of not only advertising to an engaged audience, but also of supporting local community journalism. Your advertising supports that which we are trying to maintain. So we are constantly banging the drum of impact that we can make in our community. We published a report earlier this year that is the first time we've published a community impact report. Because when people read a daily newspaper, and I should note that the Press Democrat is a 7-day-a-week newspaper, so we deliver. I get it on my doorstep 7 days a week, as do 25,000 other people. We have about 25,000 more who subscribe to us digitally, which is fantastic. So we're seeing good growth in those areas. But when you read a newspaper every day, you tend to forget by December what may have happened in February. So we published what we called our community impact report, which basically spelled out how we support the community through our journalism, whether it's community service journalism or investigative journalism or what have you. And that was probably the best received product we've done in a long, long time. People said, we had forgotten that you did this particular reporting. And so we're using that. We'll be doing another one later this year to kind of continue to reaffirm, the role that we play in the community, for the community, which I think is, it's going to have ongoing importance.
So this was the first one. Did I hear you correctly? And so That's right. It looks like twice a year is sort of the
Well, it'll be once a year in all likelihood. We did this last one I think we published it in January. It came out January 2024. We're going to do our next one. I believe we're scheduled to do either probably November or December of 2024. primarily because we've also established within the last 18 months an associated 501c3 that supports journalism through philanthropic means. And so by putting the community impact report out in November during the giving season, during the end of the tax season, we think that that'll give us a nice springboard to help, garner more support for the Press Democrat Journalism Trust, which is gaining momentum.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin in that for 1 second. I have one more question. I do want to go back to the trust.
Of course.
So, having the community understand, right, why you are important, of course, is critical. So have you ramped up the community relations side? I mean, what is the mechanism that you are being able to have that drumbeat of your messaging? How are you doing that?
So we are constantly looking for new ways to engage with the community. As I mentioned earlier, we give matched advertising support to dozens, if not more than 100 local organizations every year. I think we counted it up. It's more than $2 million a year in advertising support we give out in the community. But more so than that, myself and our leadership team, we are at events. So I'm probably at a couple events a week, just showing up to be present. We have our chief revenue officer who does the same thing. So our editor does the same thing. So we're constantly being present. We also do produced events. We host and produce 32 events a year throughout the community. These are events like Best of Sonoma, Best of Petaluma, Women in the Wine Business, for example, or best places to work. And we'll bring, in some cases, 250 to 500 people together for an evening like this. In fact, I know that, we're doing one this week. We're partnering with the local public radio station, and Aisha Roscoe, who is a host of Sunday Edition, their Sunday morning program on NPR. She's coming into town, and we've started a series this year called Trust and Democracy, which was really kind of imagined because of the importance of the election and, the whole issue of misinformation in media and, the whole thing. So this is our second in what are planned to be at least 3 this year, where we're going to talk about the process of writing stories in journalism and how things that are started end up being published. And Aisha Roscoe is going to be our keynote speaker tomorrow night, just talking about, journalism writ large from the NPR standpoint. So again, just trying to get ourselves in front of the community members, to remind them that we're here, to remind them that we're local, and to remind them, every chance I get, I tell people, no, I moved here for this job. My editor moved here from Houston, Texas for this job. We bought houses, we've set our roots, we like Sonoma County, and we're invested in the community.
Mm-hmm. So let's take the pin out of the trust and talk about that a little bit. How does that, for listeners who aren't as familiar with the, 501c3, adjacent model, can you kind of talk us through that a little bit? How are they connected? How are they not? How does it work?
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit of backstory on how it came to be as well. I mentioned earlier that the Finley family owned the Press Democrat for years. So there was Ruth Finley. Ruth Finley. She was married to Everett Person. Ruth passed away, unfortunately. Everett remarried Norma Person. And so when Everett died, Norma was left with his estate. And she was one of the original investors in SMI. So she was one of the folks who, when our managing partner went around and said, I need you to write a check, and I can't promise you'll ever get your money back, but you need to do this, she wrote a check. Well, a few years ago, the company went back out to the investors and said, we're able to do a distribution, a profit share to our ownership group. By the way, all of our owners have been paid back. The company is debt free. There's no kind of overarching, cloud hanging over us. And so they went back and said, here's a check. And she said, at my age, I really don't need more money. I don't need to amass any more wealth. So why don't we just take it and put it to good use to support journalism or scholarships or something like that? So this was before my time. A 501c3 was created. The money was put into there. And then it was built around the idea of journalism scholarships. And so we did a couple of scholarships, and then the pandemic hit and everything got put on the shelf, self-survival being key, right? And when I got here a year and a half ago, having seen some of the programs being done in Seattle or New Orleans and other places, we said, look, there's an opportunity here for us to create a philanthropic model in Sonoma County because we think the community will support it. We're independent. We have, we still have a really strong, tie. And we were looking at ways to do it. And we said, well, hey, we have this 501c3. So we changed the name slightly to the Press Democrat Journalism Trust, and we refocused the mission. We reconstituted the board. So now we have a board that's primarily external members of the community. So we have a great, engaged, diverse board. In fact, the only kind of continual thread through them is they all care about community journalism. So we have folks from Sonoma County and Napa County and kind of the North Bay. And so we just have been recently, we've taken it twofold now. So we just announced 3 scholarship recipients, and these scholarships are $2,500 a year for up to 4 years for students from the North Bay, plus paid summer internships with our company. So it's like a $10,000 scholarship plus a paid internship. So we just announced 3 scholarship recipients. But then we also are able to raise funds to subsidize journalists. We have a Report for America reporter in our newsroom right now. The trust board has decided to fund a portion of the company, a portion of that Report for America position, which helps eliminate the expense for our operating business, which is fantastic. So we're kind of looking for ways that we can use that trust to help not only, create more scholarship opportunities for students and create a pipeline into journalism education, as well as actually supporting the journalists in our market covering the topics we need to have covered. As part of this, we've gone out and had conversations. So I think it's like over 60 now, key stakeholders in the community, and said, look, we don't want to tell you what we think is important. What do you think is important for us to cover, for the next 5 to 10 years? And what's been really fascinating is, even though we had all these different people, it all boiled down to 4 things. Every single person, one way or another, it came down to housing, healthcare, particularly mental health care, education, and the environment. And the first 3, they all said we had special emphasis in communities of color. We have a pretty diverse community up here. So now we're looking for ways that we can reach out to larger institutional funders to, fund reporting that focus on the areas our communities want to know more about, to be more of an advocacy-based operation where we're not just watching what other people are doing, but rather saying, look, here's information that you need to know about, and how can we catalyze people and support around these problems. So we're trying to kind of perhaps tilt the playing field a little bit, but I think it's going really well so far.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And a beautiful segue into the conversation about your work with the California Press Foundation. And again, focusing on that pipeline, you all are doing some really wonderful things to get more young people to study and consider journalism as a career path. So how's that all going?
It's really interesting. The California Press Foundation is 120 plus years old. It's been around for a long, long time. And within the last 3 or 4 years, we've been able to really get a lot of energy in our board around essentially a reformulation or a restructure of the entire operation. What do we really want to do? There'd been a pretty consistent program around grants and internships and things like that. And we said, well, we need to think bigger, because there wasn't a whole lot of, it wasn't moving forward. It was just kind of treading water, if you will. So we're really working to do a number of things that I think are exciting. We're just about ready to hire a full-time executive director for the organization, which we've never had. We're, more aggressively pursuing fundraising, but we're also looking at ways that we can, again, reach back down into the educational world and help support young journalists. And this is someone like me. I mean, when I was in high school, my parents, I came from a solid, lower middle class family. I didn't have all of the resources to buy camera gear, for example, to be a photographer. It was only because my advisor, Roger Wu, said, I've got old gear from when I was in college, you can use it. And so I carried his camera bag around for 2 years while I was in college, or in high school, excuse me. And so, how can we as an organization go back and support high school journalism programs, junior college programs, university level programs, whether it's through equipment grants or, funding for internships, or even restarting programs that may have, been lost due to funding shortfalls. So we're really excited about the possibility of getting back in. Some of our members have created a database, which it's the Jured organization that ties journalism and education, but it tracks and it notes all of the journalism advisors and programs throughout the state of California, high school, junior college, all the way up. And so we're able to use that as a resource for a number of different things. And so there's a lot of energy around this right now, especially because we know that in generally historically underrepresented communities, we need to be more proactive in reaching in and encouraging students to study journalism. They have voices that our industry needs to hear. We bemoan the fact that it's hard to hire and kind of create a diverse newsroom. Well, but if somebody's not doing something proactively to try to inspire, those voices who are historically not heard from to participate in the process, then we're never going to get there. So we're really excited about what's going on with CalPress. I think there's a good long road ahead. We're really excited about that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Just that database alone, is just incredibly valuable. And it does make sense for an organization like y'all to sort of be the point folks on that. Yeah. We're very much looking forward to seeing what comes next with that, for sure.
Well, I would like to, California is one of the few places still, I'm speaking a little bit kind of off the cuff here, but California still has a relatively healthy, relative being a kind of a relatively healthy trade industry in California through the California News Publishers Association. In the Northwest, I know it's kind of fizzled out a bit. And, as you get fewer and fewer ownership groups and fewer publications, you don't have kind of the collection or the connectivity between publishers that you used to have. California still does a relatively good job of doing that. And I think that with the California Press Foundation as a complement to that, that's where the industry can really support education, because without those students coming up through Fresno State, through San Jose State, through Riverside, there won't be a pool of candidates for us to pick from. And we can't depend just on schools like Berkeley or USC, for example. We need schools like Riverside and Chico and Fresno and Stanislaus and, from the spectrum, not just, Berkeley, Stanford, and USC.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously I agree with that. I might be
nothing against those schools. Those are great.
Absolutely.
My wife and I are both my wife and I and our youngest daughter, state university graduates. We're big CSU fans. But it's just the diverse voices that we need to try to garner.
Oh, without question. So what do you love about journalism?
It goes back to when I was right out of college and even working in high school. I love the fact that the work that we do can have a tangible and meaningful effect on the community. It's one of those things where, you can take a photograph, write a story, and you can make a change. You can make a difference. I'll give you an example of one that's recent here in Santa Rosa. There was a couple of students who were working at a Subway in the region, and they told their teacher that they thought they were getting ripped off by their boss. And the teacher said, the teacher could have said, call the state, call whatever. The teacher said, well, you should call the Press Democrat. And so the students called one of our reporters, Phil Barber, who's a fantastic reporter. And we wrote a story about it. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm kind of shortening a little bit, but it sparked a statewide investigation, a federal investigation. The owners were forced to sell their company. They were forced to pay these students back wages. They're all of these things, all because these students called the newspaper and said, I think I'm getting ripped off. And it really opened the eyes to the community. We have another one that's bubbling now that is an organization that I think has the greatest, their mission is fantastic, helping those who are unhoused. Mm-hmm. But during the pandemic, when there were times of, no bidding contracts and things, they were getting paid a lot of money, $26 million over 2 or 3 years this course of the contract. And so one of our reporters started asking around and auditing their numbers and saying, things aren't adding up. Things just aren't adding up. And it has, again, resulted in audits by the county, audits by all these different things. Just today, in today's newspaper, the CEO announced their resignation, and they've been growing. They grew into Houston, and the Houston Chronicle is now following the story from their county. And what's interesting is you read the comments on our stories, which tend to be, comments are kind of the blessing and the curse. You love to hate them. But it's very gratifying to read in these comments when people are posting, keep it up, Press Democrat, keep on them, keep watching, keep paying attention, be the watchdog, which, again, we're trying to let our community know this is what we're here for. I mean, sometimes we don't make people happy,
right,
but this is our job, right? Yeah. And that's gratifying to hear it kind of echoed back to us in that way. But I love being able to make a change. And that's kind of been the through line my whole career. How can I do what I need to do to support the journalists and the programs and the products that will help us advance journalism and support the communities, whatever the platform.
Yes. So taking out your crystal ball again, because it was right the first time, remember? What?
And maybe the only time, you never know.
We shall see. We shall see. So what is next for journalism from your perspective?
That's a good question. I think if we're talking about journalism, I am optimistic that we're coming into an era where, so journalism for me it's a mission, right? It's something that I kind of feel in my bones. It's like someone who goes into the law enforcement or to healthcare. There's kind of this underlying thing in them that says, this is what my calling is. I'm hopeful that we're seeing a resurgence of that in the coming generation, where there's a level of public service and public support through journalism. A lot of the reporters in my newsroom, not a lot of the reporters, I would say some of the younger reporters coming into the newsroom are coming in and they want to make a difference in the world, right? And they know that they can do it through the amplification that we can provide through journalism. So I'm hopeful that there will be kind of an increasing groundswell in qualified people who understand that journalism isn't just, it's not just recording a fight on a cell phone. It's actually legitimate reporting with, standards and ethics and, a clear emphasis on what's important to the reader. I think if we look at kind of the industry as a whole, it's going to continue to shift. I think, we'll continue to see, probably more consolidation of things. Hopefully there will be kind of a pullback on some of that, where the communities can either support their own local media, or in many cases, like we're seeing now, you see startups where really qualified journalists are standing up their own news organizations in a digital format and doing some fantastic work, which is really encouraging to see. The hope that I have is that the communities pick up on that before it's tough to sustain. And do they have enough runway to get the kind of momentum that they need? My parents are in their 80s, and they grumble about the printed newspaper being now delivered in the mail, and they grumble about this and that, but they're not going to likely shift to a kind of a startup news organization. They trust the brands that they trust. So how do you inspire and get that brand recognition? How do you create enough momentum in those new startups so that you can be sustainable? Because I think you don't have a lot of time to burn. You burn a lot of cash very fast when you're doing those things, right? And so it comes down to that. You're going to see, I suspect, fewer printed publication. The cost of paper goes up, the cost of gas and tires and printing and all that stuff. So that is going to continue to kind of sunset itself. But as we've seen here, most of our new subscriptions are coming in for digital subscriptions. We still have print. So that will likely be the shift. People on their phones and people wanting to get the content however they want, rather than just a printed product. And so it's kind of the twofold, right? I'm optimistic for journalism. And then I think that there is a transition. It's just going to be a difficult one to manage with, how do you maintain and retain your audiences and advertisers to subsidize it, to pay for it? Because people have to be willing to pay for good quality content anyway.
Correct. Absolutely. So what can the average bear? What can the average person do to support this, to support these hopes and thoughts that you have about the future of journalism?
I think probably the most important thing that anybody can do is to, find a media source that you like, one that presumably is, vet them, understand what their background is, and then subscribe. Don't flush your cookies and don't be afraid to pay if it's $5 or $6 a month or $8 a month and you don't like it, cancel and then find another one. But, be willing to pay for the content. Um, you know, if people don't pay for it, then there won't be the revenue for it to be produced and there won't be the economy around it and it will just go away. I think a lot of people don't understand perhaps that, I mean, to a degree and without sounding terribly hyperbolic, but democracy is at stake without, local organizations reporting objective and factual news. Pink slime websites are easy to create and they're easy to replicate and they're really tricky and they're hard to tell the difference between legitimate stuff. So, subscribe to your local newspaper and you get a deal. Most of them have good prices for it, but support them through that way and engage in that. I think that's probably the best thing. And second to that, I go back to an election cycle, a couple of cycles back, and a friend of mine made a comment about, oh, I saw that story on Facebook. And I said, but what was the origin of the story? Well, Facebook was. I said, no, Facebook wasn't the origin. What was the origin? Well, they didn't know. So it's the old adage, if your mom tells you she loves you, check your sources, right? But in this case, figure out where things are coming from. So if you see it posted on Facebook, investigate where it came from. Be a critical thinker. Take the time to try to comprehend what's being published and formulate your own thoughts as opposed to just listening to an echo chamber that completely agrees with everything you think, right? Form your own opinions and find multiple sources to either support or offset your own particular thought. Critical thinking skills are tough. People ask me on occasion what's hurting the news industry the most. Is it technology? Is it this? I think in some cases it's apathy. People just maybe don't care enough about their local community. Maybe they live in Petaluma but work in San Francisco and they don't have kids and they're not worried about school taxes. They're not worried about this thing in their backyard and they're maybe living in a bedroom community and they just don't get engaged in their community like they used to. When my parents were young, you get out of school, you get married, you buy a house, you have a kid, you get a job, you subscribe to the newspaper, you watch Walter Cronkite, 30 years later, you retire, you get a gold watch and you do that thing. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, I've moved 10 times in the last, 15 years. And that takes it's hard to connect with the community in that way, but newspapers and local media can help you do that. So I would encourage people to find out what's going on next door, around the corner, around the block.
So for our listeners who are not familiar with pink slime, can you help them understand that? I didn't want that to go without underlying the definition.
So I hope I get this right. Pink slime was something. There was a video story that came out a few years ago, and it was talking about fast food, and it showed this video of, I can't remember if it was chicken nuggets or whatever it was, but it was this extrusion machine. It was just this pink slimy stuff that had very little, if any, nutritional value, but it was then squished out of a tube and turned into these things and then fried and sold as food. And pink slime websites or media are very much the same. So there's no nutritional value to them. They're taking things that might be plagiarized from one place or completely made up, and it makes it look like a legitimate media source. Maybe they're called the Daily Herald or the Tribune or whatever it's called. And it looks like a legitimate media source, but in reality, there's again, no nutritional value, and it's just all junk. That's what pink slime is in the media space. And they're easy to set up and they're easy to replicate and they're hard to tell sometimes if you're not paying attention and kind of giving it a critical eye.
Thank you for that. So as we wrap up today, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I really appreciate the conversation and I could talk for hours about the importance of journalism in our society and the importance of journalism in individual communities. And, my friends will tell you that I can do that for hours and hours and hours. And I do truly believe that, for me anyway, this has been a calling for my career. I've been fortunate to do it for 30 some odd years now. And And I'm really hopeful. I'm really optimistic about what we can accomplish, kind of what's down the road. But I think that the stakes could not be higher for people to not be aware of the importance of local community journalism. And um, it it's a little frightening to think of what American society would be without that fourth estate, without a solid and critical review of our governments, our local elected officials. And so I would just encourage everybody to get involved. Read a paper, vote, meet your neighbors, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Eric, so much. We so appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Betsy. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. You're, of course, invited to tune in next time for another episode of Exploring Journalism's Future, a podcast powered by the Institute for Media and Public Trust at Fresno State. Until then, please keep the faith. And for the love of democracy, join us in this critical conversation. Thank you.